Can you truly envision it, or is the gloss of the modern world too thick to peel back? Close your eyes, let your consciousness drift, stripping away the neon hum of LED screens, the relentless roar of jet engines, and the sterile, recycled breath of air conditioning. Transport yourself back to the burgeoning, uncertain spring of 1785. Imagine yourself standing on the salt-sprayed, weathered deck of a merchant brigantine. Your boots are slick with the grime of a grueling 6-week Atlantic, crossing a journey of salt pork, stale water, and the constant threat of privateers. The vessel groans, its massive oak timbers complaining under the immense strain of the tides as it slices through the thick, briny fog of the upper New York Bay. The hull vibrates beneath your feet, a rhythmic, relentless slap of the cold Atlantic against the wood that echoes the frantic beating of your own anxious heart. There are no gleaming spires of glass and steel piercing the clouds here, not yet. In this era, the sky belongs entirely to the screaming gulls and the charcoal-grey plumes of wood smoke rising from 10,000 hearths. Instead, you behold a low, jagged skyline defined by soot-stained red brick, rotting Dutch timbers from a century prior, and a literal forest of masts swaying in the harbor like a skeletal, winter-stripped woods. This is New York City, a place that has just crawled out from under the crushing 7-year weight of a devastating British military occupation. It is a city with its sleeves rolled up, its skin scarred by the Great Fire, and its pulse thrumming with a frantic, uncertain energy that teeters dangerously between a glorious rebirth and a total, agonizing collapse. But wait, take a deep, sharp breath. Can you smell it? It is a pungent, intoxicating cocktail. The biting salt spray, the sweet, sappy scent of freshly sawn white pine, the oily tang of wet hemp rope, and the earthy, omnipresent musk of livestock being driven through the muddy streets. Beneath it all lies something sharper, something more modern, the metallic, ozone-heavy scent of a city racing at a breakneck, desperate pace to outrun its own traumatic history. From 1776 to 1783, this island was the ironclad fortress of the British military, a captive city. It had been choked by martial law and nearly erased by the Great Fire of 1776, an inferno so fierce it left entire city blocks as blackened, skeletal remains. For years, the homeless and the destitute, thousands of them, lived in makeshift tents, pitched among the ruins, a purgatory of canvas and mud known as Canvas Town. To walk those streets was to walk through a graveyard of ambition. Now, in 1785, the tide is finally turning. In January of that year, this scarred peninsula became the de facto capital of the fledgling federal government under the Articles of Confederation. In just a few short years, this small spit of land, barely extending past the muddy, cow-grazed commons we now call City Hall Park, would become the most consequential stage for the greatest socio-political experiment in human history. Picture the thousands of ordinary citizens packed into the narrow, rutted streets. Their hearts are drumming against their ribs in a chaotic rhythm of profound hope and gut-wrenching fear. These aren't just dry names etched into a dusty textbook. They are fathers with calloused hands and eyes weary from years of guerrilla warfare, mothers shielding their young from the damp chill of the docks, blacksmiths smelling of scorched iron and coal, and tavern keepers with eyes like hawks, watching the horizon for the next rumor. These were real people who had bet their lives, their family fortunes, and their sacred honor on a nation that the rest of the world, the kings, the czars, and the absolute emperors firmly believed would fail within a single decade. Will this dream of a republic actually hold? Or is it just a phantom born of war? A woman might whisper, clutching a threadbare wool shawl against the damp morning air as she watches a government official pass in a flurry of papers. Or will we be swallowed by the smoke and instability of our own making? A merchant replies, his eyes fixed nervously on the distant horizon, where the British sails once loomed like a forest of ghosts. That is the vibrant, breathing truth of history. These people were not living through a foregone conclusion. They were navigating a terrifying reality where the stakes were nothing less than the future of millions yet unborn. And if you're watching this right now, stay with me, because the journey we are about to embark on will let you feel their every breath, their every tremor of anxiety, and perhaps you'll recognize those same tremors within yourself. What those crowds didn't know then, the secrets hidden behind the limestone balcony of Federal Hall, are the very choices that shaped the fabric of your life today. Step off the boat at the East River docks, dodging the heavy crates of molasses, tobacco, and tea. Mind the mud as we walk up the gentle slope toward the heart of the city. We are heading for Wall Street. Today, it is a dark, claustrophobic canyon of global finance, but in the late 1780s, it was a modest thoroughfare where residential domesticity, high-stakes commerce, and revolutionary politics collided in the same dusty air. At the corner of Wall and Nassau, your eyes are drawn to a structure that looks strikingly crisp and white against the older, sagging buildings. Federal Hall. Originally the colonial city hall, it had been transformed into a masterpiece of neoclassical authority by the visionary French architect Pierre-Charles L'Enfant between 1788 and 1789. Its towering columns and grand balcony were designed not merely for aesthetics, but as a deliberate public stage for a brand new kind of power, one that derived its mandate not from God or royal lineage, but from the consent of the people. On the 30th of April 1789, if you had been standing in that surging, breathless crowd, you would have seen him, George Washington, the man who famously refused to be king, stepping onto that very balcony. As he placed his hand upon the Bible and swore the oath as the first president under the new Constitution, his own heart was likely racing beneath his American-made broadcloth suit, a suit of humble brown, chosen specifically to snub the luxury of British imports. Thousands of eyes peered upward in a state of collective arrest. "Long live George Washington!" The shout would rise from the back, rippling through the mass of humanity like a tidal wave. Some cheered until they were hoarse, while others stood in a stunned, prayerful silence, so deep you could hear the snapping of the flags in the wind and the distant cry of a street peddler selling oysters. It was the first time in the modern era that a nation without a monarch had attempted to hand over such immense power to a common citizen. Inside those walls, the first Congress was already locked in fierce, sweaty debates, drafting the amendments that would become the Bill of Rights. Outside, the streets were a sea of humanity gossiping, hoping, and trembling at the sheer weight of the moment. The true drama wasn't just in the ritual, it was in the desperate struggle for survival. This young country was learning to walk on its own trembling legs, trying to manage a crippling mountain of war debt and build international credibility without the crutch of royalty or tradition. In New York, power wasn't hidden behind the gated walls of a distant palace. It was found in physical proximity. If you were a member of the wealthy elite, you didn't retreat to a secluded manor. You lived close enough to hear the rumble of the merchant wagons and the raw, unfiltered roar of the mob. To be near the center was to be near influence. And the greatest secret of all, one that Washington himself felt deeply, was that this forced closeness turned strangers into a community. Every small decision made over a pint of bitter ale or a shared carriage ride affected the neighbor across the street. Follow me a few blocks over to Cherry Street. The government has rented a grand 3-story townhouse belonging to Samuel Osgood, the first official presidential residence. It wasn't a sprawling estate. It was a narrow, vertical, urban home, squeezed tightly into the city's growing, chaotic grid. You can hear the horses clattering on the cobblestones outside the windows, their hooves striking sparks in the twilight. You see the liveried servants at the door, and the flashes of powdered wigs and silk stockings moving through cramped rooms that served as both private sanctuaries and public stages for the new elite. Later, the Washingtons would move to the Macomb House on Broadway to accommodate their growing court. These homes were the face of the new republic, a place that officially rejected titles of nobility, but still clung tenaciously to the habits of ceremony and social hierarchy. Inside, Martha Washington held her Friday levee receptions, events that were as much about political scouting and intelligence gathering as they were about social grace. The rules of social standing were still very much alive and well. The public rooms were reserved for influence and rigid etiquette, but the private quarters were just like any other aspect of city life, cramped, smoky from the wood-burning hearths, and close enough to the street that the smell of the city and the relentless noise of the docks never truly faded. Even luxury in 1789 meant sharing walls, hearing your neighbors argue through the plaster, and stepping out into the mud and refuse of a working port. This intimacy between the leaders and the led gave New York its unique, sharpened edge. The Republic didn't live behind iron gates. It lived on the sidewalk. Now, let's leave the quiet, polished halls of power and head back toward the churning water. If you want to know what New York truly felt like, don't look at the steeples of the churches. Look at the taverns and the raucous coffee houses. These weren't the quiet, laptop-filled cafes of today. They were loud, smoke-filled, cider-drenched chambers where information moved at the speed of a heartbeat. By the early 1790s, the Tontine Coffee House at the corner of Wall and Water Streets became the nerve center of the city's ambition. Opened in 1793, it was a chaotic hive for merchants, sea captains, and unscrupulous brokers. And just a year earlier, in 1792, a group of 24 traders gathered under a specific buttonwood tree on Wall Street to sign a simple, one-sentence agreement. They were trying to bring a modicum of order to the chaotic trading of Revolutionary War bonds and fledgling bank stocks. They didn't know they were founding the New York Stock Exchange. They were just men with cold coffee, ink-stained fingers, and a desperate need for stability, inadvertently writing the rules for a global financial empire that would one day manage the retirement savings of millions yet unborn. Down at the Battery, the city finds its breath. In the 1780s, this was already a public promenade where the harbor breezes offered a brief relief from the city's stench. It was a grand theater of humanity. Sailors with stories of the East Indies, weary laborers, wealthy merchants in velvet, and immigrant families all drifted through the same space, watching the ships come and go like the ticking of a global clock. The harbor held the city's dual reality, the glamour of international trade and the back-breaking harshness of manual labor. A single day in New York could begin with a solemn civic ceremony at Federal Hall, move to the docks where exotic goods from the far reaches of the Atlantic were being unloaded by hand, and end in a cramped, candle-lit tavern where politics, rumor, and raw ambition sat at the same scarred wooden table. Yet, in a city increasingly defined by money and vertical growth, religion still anchored the skyline and the soul. Look up. The most prominent spire belongs to Trinity Church. The original building had been reduced to ash in the 1776 fire, but by the late 1780s, it was being rebuilt with a fervor, a symbol of the city rising from its own funeral pyre. Nearby, St. Paul's Chapel stood as a miraculous survivor of the flames. Walk inside with me. The year is 1789. The interior speaks in the language of 18th century craftsmanship, sturdy, orderly, and ancient. This is where Washington came immediately after his inauguration for a moment of quiet, desperate reflection. He knelt in a pew that still exists today, perhaps wondering if the weight he had just accepted would crush him. But these sacred spaces had a practical, visceral side too. In a city built almost entirely of dry wood, fire was a constant, terrifying ghost that haunted every hearth. Church bells didn't just call the faithful to prayer. They were the city's primitive alarm system. When those bells began to clang out of rhythm, the community knew that black smoke was rising somewhere. Those very bells saved countless families from being burned alive in their beds, and today, their echoes remind us that even in the middle of capitalist chaos, faith and community were the only real lighthouses. At the very southern tip of the island sat Fort George, a crumbling stone relic of colonial power near Bowling Green. By the end of the decade, the fort was strategically obsolete. Plans were drawn up in 1790 to demolish its ramparts and build Government House, intended as a permanent, palatial presidential residence. It was a project that revealed the city's conflicted soul. New York was still thinking in terms of forts and governors, even as it tried to evolve into a republic of citizens. But history moved faster than the architect. The federal capital would soon depart for Philadelphia and eventually the swampy shores of Washington, D.C., and Government House would never fulfill its royal-scale ambitions. It eventually served as a custom house before being torn down to make way for more commerce. In New York, profit always outpaced monuments. Security in these years was a fragile, improvised thing. A patchwork of local militias and a few exhausted town watchmen stood guard over a population far more interested in the fluctuating price of flour than the art of war. Uniforms were a rare luxury. Supplies were perpetually unreliable, and the eyes of the street were always turned toward the next incoming ship, the next commercial opportunity, and the next high-stakes gamble. How did this exploding, crowded city even survive? This is where the grand dream met the most basic of human needs: water. How do you keep tens of thousands of people alive on a small, salt-surrounded island without modern plumbing? In the late 18th century, clean water was a luxury many couldn't afford. As the city's density increased, wells turned salty or foul, contaminated by the very life teeming above them. The Tea-Water Pump near Chatham and Roosevelt Streets became legendary. People would wait in long, frustrated lines or pay significant sums to water criers for water to be delivered from this specific source, because it was the only thing on the island that didn't taste of brine and rot. The story of New York's water didn't end with a simple pump, though. In 1799, the Manhattan Company was chartered under the guise of providing clean water to the city, but it was given a secret, genius loophole to operate as a bank. That is a quintessential New York story, a place where essential infrastructure and high finance are so hopelessly entangled you can't tell them apart. That company eventually became part of the lineage of Chase Bank. Think about that. The financial lifeblood that flows through modern global investment accounts today began with a desperate, muddy search for clean water in a growing 18th century town. Moving across the land was just as chaotic as the finance. New York was a walking city. Lower Manhattan was small enough that you could cross its entirety on foot in 20 minutes. But the journey was treacherous. The streets were not paved with gold. They were paved with mud, horse manure, and jagged, ankle-breaking cobblestones. And yes, the urban legends are true. Thousands of pigs roamed the streets freely. They were the city's primitive, unofficial sanitation department, eating the mountains of trash that people threw out their windows. If you were a working New Yorker, you lived in a narrow, multi-story house, constantly smelling your neighbor's cabbage cooking and living in perpetual fear of a single spark from a poorly swept chimney. Yet, even in this squalor, you could feel the future pushing aggressively north. Even before the famous grid plan of 1811, surveyors were already eyeing the island's rocky hills and marshes as something that could be measured, carved up, and sold for profit. Everyone felt it. The city was going to grow, it was going to consume the island, and nothing on earth could stop its momentum. When the federal capital moved away in 1790, some critics thought New York would wither and fade into a provincial backwater. They were profoundly wrong. The city had already built a different kind of engine, one fueled not by political titles, but by the harbor, by international credit, and by the sheer, unadulterated audacity of its people. Its stock market would soon be formalized. Its population would double and then triple within a generation. The streets would become louder, more crowded, and more international with every passing ship. The New York of the 1780s didn't invent modern capitalism in a single day, and it certainly didn't solve the myriad problems of urban life. But it did something far more important. It proved that a diverse, rowdy, and relentlessly ambitious port city could host a national government and a global market at the exact same time. It proved that a republic could function amidst the noise, the smells, and the greed without tearing itself apart. When you walk down Wall Street today, you aren't standing on the same soil the original island has been paved, built over, and expanded with landfill dozens of times, but you are standing in the same corridor of history. The skyscrapers have replaced the church spires. The subways have replaced the Tea-Water pumps. But the institutional DNA, the intertwining of finance and governance, the blurring of public and private life, the relentless, heart-pounding pace of opportunity was all born right here in the late 1780s. This story serves as a powerful reminder, especially for those of us looking toward an uncertain future, that the foundation of America wasn't built on gleaming, sterile marble. It was built on the resilience of ordinary people standing in the mud. They lived through a total war, through a citywide fire, through a period of total economic uncertainty, and they chose to build anyway. That is the lesson we must hold on to. A nation born in chaos can still find a way forward because real people, with all their fears, their prejudices, and their desperate hopes, refuse to give up on the dream of tomorrow. Take a moment to think deeply about them. Think of the sailor returning from a 2-year voyage, his heart heavy with worry for a family he hasn't seen and may not find among the ash and the new brick. Think of the mother clutching her child on the dusty sidewalk, cheering for Washington, while secretly terrified that a single tipped lantern could burn her entire world down tonight. Think of the small-time merchant in the Tontine coffee house, his hand shaking as he signs a contract that bets his children's entire future on a market that barely exists. Their emotions weren't dry historical facts. They were real pain, real joy, and a desperate hunger to survive. The New York of the 1780s isn't just a story about the past, it is a mirror for our present. In a world full of rapid economic shifts, environmental concerns, and social divisions, we can learn that true strength lies in our proximity to one another and our ability to turn chaos into a new beginning. They proved that a nation doesn't have to be perfect to be great. It just has to be persistent. If this journey through time has touched your heart or made you rethink what it means to be a part of this ongoing experiment, share this with someone. Start a conversation about the lessons hidden in our muddy, complicated past, and tell me, which city, which street, or which moment in time should we bring to life next? Together, we will continue to explore the emotional heart of history, keeping the thread between the past and the future from ever breaking, because you are the one who keeps that story alive.